Once upon a glorious time in music history, composers of concertos used to see fit to yield the floor in the middle of concertos and let the featured soloist go do his own thing for a while. Initially, this was limited to brief pauses where the soloist would be expected to improvise a brief, unmeasured flourish. For example, take this passage at the end of Bach's Fifth Keyboard Concerto. Whereupon you might do something like this. And then the music goes on. By the time of Haydn and Mozart, though, it had become an established feature of the concerto form that the orchestra would come to rest on a giant 6/4 chord. And this would be the cue for the soloist to take the thematic material from that movement and go crazy for 2 or 3 minutes. And this is what people are usually thinking of when they say the word cadenza, although technically the term does apply to those brief, unmeasured flourishes as well. Composers would often publish their own cadenzas to their own concertos on the side, but the fact that they didn't write them out explicitly in the score indicates that they were expecting the soloist or encouraging the soloist to add their own thing, whether written out ahead of time or improvised on the spot. And keep in mind that in those days, improvising was something that classical musicians did quite a bit of. Well, as they say, give an inch and they'll take a mile. So the story goes, there were a good many soloists who kind of enjoyed the cadenza period a little too much and had a way of leaving orchestras and audiences twiddling their thumbs for upwards of 10 minutes. Fittingly, it fell to a composer who had once been one of the greatest improvisers of his generation, Ludwig van Beethoven, to be like, yo, party's over, kids, and in his last concerto, The Emperor, at the moment where you would expect there to be a cadenza, it actually says in the score, do not play a cadenza, but go directly to this. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Which blends seamlessly with the orchestra's reentrance. It feels kind of like a mini cadenza, except it's explicitly marked in the score as a non-cadenza. And from that point forward, it became increasingly and rapidly more common for composers to not give the soloist any options at all. Either they would write out the cadenza explicitly in the main score, or they would skip over having a cadenza section entirely. I personally think the most interesting cadenzas tend to be those written by someone other than the composer of the concerto. The very first concerto that I ever heard when I was 6 years old was the Beethoven First. And the recording of it that I heard was that by Glenn Gould. And if you aren't familiar with the Gould recording, he wrote his own cadenzas for the first and third movements. And I'll just give you a sample of what he did for the first movement. He took some of the themes from that movement and wrote a clever little fugue on them. For those of you keeping track of copyright, I'm going to claim fair use on this. It's definitely not Beethoven in style, but there is that thematic continuity. And I just thought it was such a cool feature of concertos that you could stick whatever you wanted in there, within reasonable time limits, of course. So I always figured that the next best thing to writing your own cadenza would be to pick something that someone else, other than you and other than the composer of the concerto, wrote. Think of it like an author writing a book and then some other author writing the foreword or the afterword. For example, Beethoven wrote cadenzas to Mozart's 20th piano concerto. This is the concerto that begins... And here's what Beethoven does, and if you know this concerto, you'll recognize some of the themes. It's not Mozart in style, but it's not too far removed either. It's just a few decades later. And it's kind of cool that Mozart, the star composer of his generation, had cadenzas written for his concerto by the guy who was basically his successor. But Beethoven's own cadenzas for his own concertos are generally pretty good as well, and I have to mention as one of my favorites the one he did for his second concerto, and it's kind of interesting because he wrote it a couple decades after the concerto, so it almost feels like someone else wrote it. The second concerto is a very early composition. It in fact came before the so-called first concerto. It was just published second, that's why we know it as the second. But it was written in the sort of semi-Haydn Mozart style that's characteristic of Beethoven's earliest work. Whereas the cadenza hails from Beethoven's mature period. Like Glenn Gould a century and a half later, he wrote a fugue. And right off the bat, I have to say it's kind of funny that he took the opening theme and randomly decided to begin the cadenza with it upside down. And this is very much the same Beethoven that gave us the late piano sonatas and late quartets. And it's marvelous to see the elder composer riffing off of his younger self. I really hope there are still pianists out there writing their own cadenzas, especially for the concertos where you're not supposed to. It would be great fun to take one of the concertos where the cadenza is written out explicitly, like the Tchaikovsky First. Actually, there are multiple cadenzas in this concerto, but I'm thinking of the one at the end of the movement. It would be a golden opportunity to bring back the famous theme at the opening, which notoriously doesn't get heard again after the beginning. But imagine how taken aback the audience would be if they were expecting Tchaikovsky's own cadenza. But instead you gave them something like this. Okay, well, that doesn't sound like Tchaikovsky, but that's kind of the point. I would pay to hear something like that. Here's an even weirder idea. A piano recital of nothing but cadenzas. Short showpieces taken out of context. It's kind of like Franz Liszt writing a concert fantasy on themes from this or that opera. Instead, it's 2-minute fantasies on themes from this or that piano concerto. And just like Liszt writing operatic fantasies, this would be a way for performers and audiences to enjoy highlights of their favorite concertos without having to have the whole orchestra there. Some of them actually do stand on their own decently well. The endings might be a little awkward because you're expecting the orchestra to come in and it doesn't, but you just have to improvise a few extra bars to tack on to the end of each. What do you think? Would you go to a piano recital like that? Let me know.